sorry, I started recording, that are so essential to our generation, but we're not the ones making the policy generally. So just as some ground rules, like I said, people who aren't panelists, please keep yourself muted. Please keep your cameras off just so we can see all the panelists. And if you have any questions, you can send them directly to me in the chat. And that's pretty much it. Panelists, would you like to start introducing yourself? Angel, you can start.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. My name is Angel Nwadibia. I am from the DMV, specifically Maryland. I am an editorial fellow at Our Climate Voices, an organization focusing on centering the voices of those who are most affected by climate change and environmental racism. And I am the executive, or one of the executive organizers of the Youth Climate Action Team's hub in the DMV.
Thank you so much for joining us. Hridesh?
Hi everyone, my name is Hridesh Singh. I am a youth climate organizer based in Rochester, New York. I am the co-founder and I serve as the executive director of the New York Youth Climate Leaders, which is a policy-driven coalition of over 60 youth groups from across the state dedicated to combating the climate crisis and implementing just, equitable, and effective climate solutions in New York State.
Thank you so much. Liam?
Hi, thanks for having me today. I am from Rochester, New York, like Hridesh. I am involved with Rochester Youth Climate Leaders locally, and I'm the co-director of government affairs for the organization Hridesh was talking about, the New York Youth Climate Leaders.
Great, Nikhil?
Hey everyone, my name is Nikhil Balakumar. I am the founder and principal at the Greentel group. We are a clean energy company focused on modernizing and decarbonizing our electric and natural gas infrastructure. And so, as many of you might know, 90% of our emissions is going to rely on, completely revamping our electric and natural gas grids. And so that's what we're focused on.
Great. Colter, do you want to go next?
Absolutely. Hey everybody, my name is Colter Adams. I'm from Falls Church City, Virginia, and I'm one of the co-directors for environmental policy at GGI. I'm also a graduate of Conserve School, which is an environmental leadership program in northern Wisconsin. And I'm super excited to be talking to everybody today about how we harness the youth movement to address these pressing issues under COVID.
Wonderful. And last but not least, Evan.
Hey y'all, my name's Evan. I'm also from Falls Church, Virginia. I work alongside Colter as a co-director of environmental policy at GGI. And I'm super happy to have all you guys here today to talk about these important issues.
Thank you all so much. I don't think I've introduced myself. So I'm Megan Cooper. I'm the director of advocacy for environment policy here at GGI. And now I guess we're just going to get started. So as you all know, we're here to talk about the notion that the environment has been somehow miraculously cured by people quarantining at home. We want to emphasize that just because some waterways are clear and some cities have wild animals returning, it doesn't mean that climate justice is not an issue. Quite the opposite, it highlights the unsustainable and unnatural way we live in relation to our environment and how desperately new advocates are needed to guide us as we step back into the post-quarantine world. At the Greater Good Initiative, we believe that youth voices are essential, and that's why we're so excited to have so many young panelists here with us. And by the end of the discussion, that we hope that we will all have learned about the climate justice movement and how to join in the fight. So to start off, I want to ask every one of our panelists, what do you think is the biggest obstacle to climate justice right now?
I can start. In my opinion, the biggest obstacle to climate justice, from where I'm standing, is not centering the voices of those who are disproportionately affected by climate change and the horrendous environmental policy that our governments have put in place. For instance, where I'm from, Maryland, the most prevalent climate justice or climate action organization is predominantly white and male. However, Maryland is an interesting place in that the people who most feel the brunt of, for instance, pollution and toxic waste are Black, Indigenous, and Latinx communities. For instance, I live 20 minutes away from this place called Brandywine, Maryland, a place that is 70% African American and is within the vicinity of at least 5 coal-powered power plants. And they're in the process of opening up a new one. And yet you don't see any of the people from these communities heading the fight for environmental justice and climate justice in Maryland specifically. So I think that's our biggest obstacle, not focusing on the communities that are most affected.
I think that's a really great point. Evan, how about you go next?
Sure. Yeah. So Angel brought up some really good points, and I'd just like to add that I think there are sort of some specific opposition groups that are sort of holding up climate justice. So whether that be sort of a combination of vested interests, so people that are sort of specifically involved in these carbon-intensive industries, but there's also sort of a legitimate problem when it comes to sort of people that are going to be affected by a transition plan, right? There are people that sort of immediately negatively impacted by sort of transitioning to green energy. And obviously sort of you can redistribute some of the losses and sort of help those people out. But in the interim, those people are going to be concerned with transitioning. And sort of, I think when you look at climate justice, it's kind of difficult to talk about those specific people and those sort of communities, but you have to sort of bring them in. I think one thing that's important to do is sort of connect and package environmental issues sort of within a framework of other issues that are sort of really important and significant. And in that way, you can really sort of engage and excite people in a way that environmental issues don't necessarily often do.
Yeah, those intersections are really important, and that's why we're here today.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that. I mean, that's really a great point. My answer at a high level would be that I think we really need to connect the dots and frame the issues in a better way. I mean, the reality of the situation is most communities aren't thinking about climate justice. I mean, even recently, most communities weren't thinking about racial injustice, right? And I think we have to acknowledge the hard truths that everyone has their own different priorities, and we need to create a framework that connects all those dots and does it in a way that is appealing to everyone. And I think, I remember when AOC, first put out her Green New Deal resolution, and I was a bit confused by it because I've been so in the weeds on the clean technology space, and I was like, okay, it's, climate change is the greatest existential threat we've ever faced. It also represents the greatest wealth creation opportunity we've ever faced, but it doesn't just stop there, right? I mean, throughout American history, we've stimulated the economy, created all this new wealth, but what we totally forgot about was that it wasn't equally accessible to everyone. And there's a lot of different social justice issues that are needed to address those, whether it's healthcare or education or housing and all of that. And so I think really putting all of that together is really a way that we can attract a broader base of constituents to move these issues forward.
Yeah, and sorry, go for it. Go ahead.
All right, sorry about that. Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the fundamental problems with trying to balance bipartisan environmental policy solutions and racial justice and social injustice and incorporating those into our environmental policy is I think that there's this prevailing notion that the only way to constructively create environmental solutions that appeal broadly, kind of without these political biases interfering, is by avoiding those difficult conversations and neglecting them. So framing everything from an economic standpoint, framing everything from a prioritization of costs and trying to prove that environmental progress can make people money. And I think that's just not sustainable, like within the movement. And I think that as Evan and I were crafting, kind of the GGI's stance on environmental issues, as we were crafting our first policy, one of the things that we came up with quickly is we were trying to figure out how to create a bipartisan policy solution in Virginia was that you really you can't even begin to do that without investigating and addressing those social justice issues as well. So I think that it's kind of inherent within the crisis that we're facing. Those problems really are like we have to address them.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add on that in terms of, and also, I think another issue when we talk about climate justice and the frameworks that surround this really weighty topic is that we don't really have an accurate understanding oftentimes when we talk about like justice issues, because the struggle for climate justice and racial justice, it's not just a U.S. focused thing; it's an international movement. We know that the communities that are actually literally on the front line of this crisis are actually in the global south, in places that were formerly colonized by European powers. For example, there's a wide array of Pacific islands. One glaring example is the islands of Kiribati, which are literally just years away from being completely submerged by rising sea levels. This is the same in the Maldives, a small chain of islands in the Indian Ocean, which is also just about a decade or two away from being completely submerged by rising sea levels. You have threats of increasing number of climate refugees, which are refugees that are forced to move from their homeland due to extreme weather events. And there's been estimations from groups like the United Nations that if we don't truly combat the climate crisis, we will see literally hundreds upon hundreds of millions of people from across predominantly the global south being forced to move and flee from their homes, with millions just from the South Asian country of Bangladesh alone. So when we talk about climate justice, the climate justice not only applies to frontline communities in the United States, but applies to communities across the world, especially in the global south. And unfortunately, oftentimes when we talk about climate justice, we oftentimes leave out those communities from the global south. We leave out indigenous communities. We leave out lower class African American communities and lower class Latinx communities. So when we talk about climate justice, this is a universal aspect that must be a multiracial, multi-class, international struggle for justice, peace, and prosperity for all communities.
That's really great. That's a really important view to have. Liam, what about you?
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is the political context of today. Our communities, our nation, and the world is overrun by this virus, and it's presented a really convenient front for the Trump administration and others to roll back environmental regulations. And I think that presents a challenge in, we really need to solve COVID-19, but at the same time, we can't forget about climate change. I also think that the public health crisis and the racial justice movement presents opportunities to work at the intersection of these different crises, and especially with recovery from the coronavirus. So I think that there's a significant challenge posed by the other issues that are really, really important to people today. But to address climate change, in addition to those, we need to find ways to address different issues simultaneously.
So that kind of ties into my next question. So I'm going to direct it towards Liam. How has coronavirus contributed to some of these previously existing obstacles, like the rise in single-use plastics during a time where PPE is so essential, or individual transportation rather than public transportation for fear of transmission of the disease? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, those are good points. I would assume that single-use plastics use has increased because of the need for masks and gloves. I tend to look at this through a political lens, where, as I mentioned earlier, the Trump administration has been rolling back environmental regulations. We've also heard that because of the coronavirus, people have been traveling less, which is actually reduced greenhouse gas emissions. But that's not to say that this is a cure. It's not to say that the virus is helping us. It has presented challenges in terms of messaging around coronavirus, though, because people are like, "Oh, emissions reduced, we're good." but you're like, no, as soon as this public health crisis is over, we're going to see emissions tick right back up again unless we take significant action.
Yeah, I remember a conversation when we were talking about what our first environment policy should be, and it really was about that, about the fact that like we're seeing so many posts that are like glorifying this natural environment and like, oh, the river is so blue and it's so clear, but like the reality is that like the Trump administration is scaling back EPA regulations and stuff like that, which is really, it's problematic for the fight for climate justice.
I can jump in here at a bit of a different perspective. I mean, honestly, and I think this might be a bit of a controversial answer, but I think a lot of us would agree that this pandemic, I think in the long run could ultimately be a blessing in disguise. We've known we've had all these different issues, from housing to healthcare to education to food security, to how all those issues disproportionately affect minority communities. But up till now, I mean, I've been in the legislative world for a couple of years now, and a lot of this was, these are just, talking points that politicians had heard all the time, and at a certain point they kind of became numb to it. And you'd kind of, we'd have one bill that we'd pass that would address some of these issues, and then we'd say we'd check the box and move on. But I think really what's happening right now is, all the institutional issues in our society, specifically in American society, are coming to the forefront. And frankly, I don't even think we're at the worst point yet. I mean, I think this fall, I mean, we're still kind of running on, government stimulus money, like unemployment, checks are still going. We don't even know if those are going to continue. I think this fall is when we're really going to hit rock bottom, and it's going to suck. But I think the fact is, like, Trump is doing all these different things, and he's been doing them for years now. And I think the best we can do while he's in office is work with Sierra Club and others to sue him every single step along the way to slow things down. But fact is we got to go vote. I mean, we got to vote. We got to vote him out, and we got to have a plan come 2021. I mean, this is a prediction I have, that I think by this fall things are going to be so bad that I think Biden will be able to be in on Medicare for all, and I think it'll be politically feasible, not just to the left, but to the middle and some of the right. A lot of these issues that no one thought would be, politically feasible are going to become feasible. And I think hopefully this paves the way for, much broader institutional change come 2021. But of course, we can work at the state level to start addressing a lot of this.
Yeah, I think one of the problems too in regards to environmental policy, with just the news cycle being so negative, is that there's this desperation for a silver lining, which I think is how these kind of anecdotal observations about wildlife returning have actually made it into major publications. But I think that's one of the most difficult things, is kind of reach this crisis point with public health and this crisis point with racial justice, is we've kind of segmented all of these areas into separate things, and kind of it almost feels like, especially at the federal level and in some cases at the state level too, there's this prioritization of these issues as if they're separate. And I think that, well, we need to, ultimately the Trump administration is not going to provide the leadership that's necessary to rally, states and the country and other countries together to solve these challenges. But I think that one of the things that we can start to do is work at the local level to provide the impetus for that change by working through the various movements that we're all part of, and rallying youth towards this cause. Because I think that as long as it continues to be segmented separately, and as long as it continues to be prioritized low because of the way environmental issues are currently portrayed in the media, then we're really going to struggle to accomplish anything at a higher level, even under the Biden administration, right? As he takes over crisis handling, assuming he wins the election, of these other issues that are predominant, there's still the concern that environmental issues might not be brought up in the way that they need to be.
Yeah, just to add on to Nikhil's point, I think it's pretty significant that, like, there has been a significant amount of political capital that's been sort of mobilized by the COVID crisis. And I know this might be slightly anecdotal, but I think we all know that there's been a significant amount of youth engagement sort of in the recent months. And that's something that we can specifically sort of use around environmental issues, right? With the right sort of packaging and making it sort of palatable and presentable for youth. That's something that we can really sort of use to get these issues out there and get these issues sort of received and accepted.
On that note, Evan, with youth being so engaged, I feel like I've been talking with a lot of people who feel like although people have been really engaged, it feels like it's kind of like slowing down. And it's this social media performative activism. And I'm just wondering, like, where do you guys see that going? And how do you create long-lasting change when people are posting and sharing things so that they aren't like left out, or is that even a fair thing to say?
Yeah, no, I think there's definitely some truth in that. And to Nikhil's point, like it ultimately does come down to voting, right? A lot of this activism is somewhat meaningless if you don't sort of go and make your voice heard at the polls, right? So I think a lot of it comes on the sort of, a lot of the onus is on sort of environmental activists, right? To continue this energy and package issues in a way that's sort of exciting and invigorating for youth and for other voters as well.
To add on to that, I mean, I think we've all been thinking about this, right? We've been on Instagram and we've been seeing all these posts for months, and honestly, in my mind, it's, you know, we've gotten a lot of change, but it's like, to what end, right? Like, what's the long-term strategy here? And I mean, to be honest, like, I haven't posted that much about all of this because it's in my mind, like, it's going on, it's great, and I've been protesting, but I've just been really bothered about what's the long-term path forward. And I actually kind of like started whiteboarding this out, and like the way I kind of see it is that there's kind of two general areas of impact. There's the elections, and there's a couple ways you can get involved there, and then there's the continued activism and pressure and engagement with political officials on key issue areas, like from today through the end of time, and we got to be engaging all the time. And so, I mean, to start with elections, like, yes, we need to vote, but I think this really all starts with educating yourself on who's up and down the ballot. I think that's one of the greatest challenges we have in our democracy, because every day we you know, when we go to the polls, there's all sorts of positions, all sorts of people, and I know so many people, including myself for a time, you would just vote along party lines, right? Or even in the primaries, it gets a little more difficult if you're a Democrat or Republican. You don't really know what to do. And so educating yourself on who's up and down the ballot, you know, getting involved in campaigns, you know, based on who you believe in, voting. And then you guys aren't that far away from this. Like, I'm 28 now, but it's also about running for office. You can run for office at 25. You could be the mayor of DC or in the member of House of the Representatives in any state or in the federal government at 25. And so that's not easy. I mean, the political establishments on both sides, they don't truly support democracy. They don't want free and open primaries, and we've seen people like AOC and others disrupt that. And so I think that's a big issue we need to work on, because the establishment is the establishment, and the only way things are really going to change, even within the Democratic Party, like, which is, you know, right now the lesser of two evils, is we need new blood and we need new perspectives. On the non-election side, I think we have to be continually working with politicians every day on these issue areas and making sure they don't forget about them. It's not we passed one, you know, racial injustice bill and we're done, right? Like, that's not the end of it. It's we got to keep going. And so, you know, I think there's really two ways, like, you know, people can go. It's, you know, you guys, I think many of the people here are, you know, just graduating high school and going into college, but in terms of figuring out what you're going to do, like, you can make a career out of this, right? You could go work for the different organizations that are focused on certain issues, and that could be a nonprofit or think tank, like many people think. But like, for me, like, we do policy, but we also do like the engineering and the clean energy technology innovation side of things as well. And so there's a lot of ways you could make a career out of this. Like, because we need policy and innovation for all these issues. And if that's not necessarily something you want to commit to full time, volunteer, right? You don't have to work for these organizations, but you can volunteer for them. And I think a lot of this is, maybe this is something this organization can work on or others, but making it really easy for people to find access to opportunities based on what they're interested in is something we really need to figure out.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point. Just if no one has anything else on that, I'm going to move on to, do you think that the response or lack thereof to the coronavirus is similar to that of climate change? And this is kind of related to what we were just talking about, but how do you make those elected officials listen? Like, how do you get them to hear you?
Yeah, definitely. I can take this one. It's funny that, the coronavirus pandemic would come this year, because largely last year, 2019, it was the year of the climate, pretty much, not only in the United States, but across the world. The rise of Fridays for Future with Greta Thunberg. The Green New Deal resolution was introduced in the House and the Senate, February 2019. You saw in state legislatures across the nation passing lots of really great climate legislation, including in New York State, where we passed the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which is setting our state to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. So last year had a lot of really important milestones in the climate movement, and saw one of the largest protests in environmental history with the global climate strikes between September 20th and 27th of 2019. And it's interesting that the pandemic would come now, on the back of such a mass mobilization led by young people combating climate change. Because in both cases, unfortunately, there's still lots of disputing the science and the facts behind both COVID-19 and climate change. We know that both the coronavirus pandemic and climate change disproportionately affects communities of color in the United States, but the global South overall. And we know that we have the solutions to both these crises, but we just need the political will to implement them. Whether that be for the coronavirus pandemic, increasing the amount of healthcare infrastructure that we have, even though the most developed nation in the history of the world, the United States, we still have nearly 90 million Americans who are either uninsured or underinsured because of our current broken healthcare system. It's the same thing for the climate crisis. We have the technologies, we have technology to transition away from our fossil fuel driven society to a clean energy economy that works for us all. So as you mentioned, like what is it gonna take to come these the racial justice issues that are prevalent across this nation is simply the political will, and that has to be driven by our generation in allyship and partnership with the generations that have preceded us. Because we've seen that if you have the movement behind you, if you have a broad coalition, a multi-class, multiracial, multi-generational coalition pushing for comprehensive, equitable, and effective solutions to any crises, you can overcome any political barrier that might be in place. And it simply just takes the political will for that to happen.
Angel, I'm going to ask you your response to that question too.
Yeah, I completely agree with Hridesh. I think that when we look at the people most affected by COVID-19, we see that they are predominantly communities of color, low-income communities. And there's kind of been this lack of action when it comes to the current administration to help ease the population out of the hardships that Corona is causing, both economic and medical. But I do think that, at least what I've been seeing on social media, anecdotal evidence, take this with a grain of salt, I've been seeing a lot more mobilization when it comes to these issues. And like we've been saying throughout the entirety of this panel, Corona, while terrible, has been almost the perfect storm to highlight the importance of intersectionality between all of these movements and all of these issues. For instance, National Children's Campaign, Your Work is My Family, youth-led group focusing on promoting the rights of essential workers. But at the same time, they work at the intersection of racial justice as well. So I do think that, like Hridesh said, if we're going to get anything done, we do need the political will to back it up. But in order for our politicians to hear our voice, we need the power of Generation Z, to uplift these issues that are going to be affecting us in the future primarily, Once again, we see organizations such as Sunrise, Youth Climate Action Team, GGI, spearheading these issues, whether they be environmental, racial, etc. And I think that if we channel the youth voice into these different outlets, then we can get a lot done.
I completely agree with that. I think that there's a lot of power that youth voices hold. We just have to make sure that people are they know that it's okay to say them, say what they believe and fight for what they care about.
Yeah, I just want to add on, completely agree with Angel, and the importance of putting youth voices at the forefront of various movements, especially youth voices that have historically been marginalized by society, but also not forgetting the importance of intergenerational activism. That we have partners, we have allies in generations that have preceded us, whether that be boomers or Gen X. It's always really great to see boomers at climate strikes. That's some of my favorite things. At least locally in the Rochester area, there's this group called the Raging Grannies, and they would always come to our strikes and sing their climate-related songs and stuff. And it's always really inspiring to see our elders come in solidarity with us, because as I mentioned earlier, in any movement, but specifically the climate movement, movements are only successful when they're multiracial, multi-class, geographically diverse, and intergenerational. And that was shown with the civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s, the anti-war movement against the war in Vietnam during the 60s and 70s, where you had younger veterans working in solidarity with old timers in protest against the continued American involvement in the war in Vietnam. And we're seeing that even with the current climate movement, that we have elder statesmen like Bill McKibben of 350 working with youth activists such as Greta Thunberg. That intergenerational component and that internationalist component is really key, and especially when it comes to the international climate movement.
If I may add an additional piece to that, I feel like that intergenerational piece is really fundamental. I think Gen Z in particular has a tremendous amount of power. But I think it becomes way more powerful when it's in coordination with the folks who kind of who've been working with the politicians for a while, who've been working on all these issues. I mean, one of the things we did in DC, for example, was we had a mix of a Gen Y, Gen Z, very activist, focused on the outcomes, sort of coalitions that would push kind of move the goalposts more to the left, right? It's like they're pushing all these politicians on all these issues, and then it gave people like me the room to come in and say well, let's talk about these more progressive, practical, clean energy solutions. And so I think we really need to be coordinated on this and understand we can all play different roles. Like if you guys are the left flank and forcing this whole broader conversation, then it just opens the door for a lot of things. But I think that needs to be kind of done in coordination with a lot of the current experts and people who are on the ground right now. I think it gives us a lot more leeway to push for the solutions we never would have dared push for 5 or 10 years ago.
I'm going to direct my next question back at you, Nikhil. So economic concerns after the pandemic, or during them actually, have led to governments providing tax changes and subsidies to oil and gas companies. In an attempt to kickstart the economy, how will COVID-19 impact prioritization of green technologies and other sustainable business models?
Yeah. So I mean, so first, I figure I'll talk about oil, then gas, and then about the clean technologies we need to deploy. So oil. So they are getting more subsidies now. They've been getting subsidies forever at this point. The one thing I will say though is I think those subsidies, they will lead to short-term consequences, but I think there are these broader macro changes that are happening that have become pretty evident in the past, just few months. Oil companies are writing off and divesting, quite a bit of assets right now because they just aren't seeing the long-term demand they did a year or 2 years ago. Their oil companies are consolidating right now because of those same issues. And so I think there are those macro changes that are, you know, reducing the size of these industries, but that by no means is gonna be enough to really get us to where we need to get to. And it's a complicated situation, right? Because these are industries that are destroying the planet, but they're also responsible for a significant portion of the economy and jobs. And it's really like, how do we make that transition? And I don't have the full solution for this, but I feel like at least the first piece of this is like, we need a federal carbon tax. Like, we need that broader market mechanism that is forcing them to move in the direction we need to. But really, like, this isn't going to be pretty. Like, getting the oil industry to just completely disappear, only be used for certain things. Like, there's going to need to be a broader government intervention. There's going to need to be some sort of buyout mechanisms, like whether it's early retirement for people and these good packages. It's going to be a mix of stuff, and I don't really have a true answer for that one, but I'd like to think we're kind of moving in the right direction. Going to gas, a lot of folks are very anti-gas, as they should be, but I will say, in terms of we have to complete, like, so many of our economies are going to be moving on to our electricity grid, because electricity is the one source of energy we know can be clean. And so we need to add all this clean energy to support whatever the electricity grid is supporting now, but we have to move commercial buildings onto there, the transportation sector, the industrial sector. And the fact is we're not going to be able to put enough renewables onto the grid while delivering affordable, reliable power quickly enough. And so natural gas is going to be a bridge fuel until we can fully decarbonize the grid. I think that's just a fact. But that being said, there are a lot of areas where they're pushing for new gas plants, and I think those are areas where we don't need to do it. I think some of the existing ones need to stay online until we can really get enough generation onto the grid. The other piece is, like, the gas infrastructure is, we can actually repurpose it. Green hydrogen is becoming a bigger and bigger. I think this has really been the year of green hydrogen. Up till now, it was very speculative of whether it could really be a fuel source. And so for context, like electricity, like batteries, like electric vehicles, that sort of small scale transportation makes sense for batteries and such. But when we're talking about ships and planes and all these larger industrial scale transportation, batteries aren't going to work. And so I think that's where we can take our natural gas grid and repurpose it. And that's where we don't have to wipe out that entire economy. We could repurpose them towards something cleaner. Finally, sorry, I'm rambling a little bit. Moving on to the actual clean energy technologies we need to deploy. Like, it's like a couple of people said, they exist. We have them. They're here right now. And this is a very complicated issue, but the fact is that the old paradigm is run by monopoly utilities who've been monopolies for the past century. They don't know that much about these technologies, and even if they did, they're century-old giants who can't deploy them quickly enough. And so the biggest issue there is we really need to open up our grids to the market and to innovation, because right now, you talk about you see all these nice articles about more solar and more wind and more batteries and all of that, but really, like, the market for all those technologies right now, they're feeding on table scraps, because the utilities have completely closed off their grids to any really meaningful innovation. So that's really what Greentel is focused on unlocking the grids and really creating a market on top of it so we can move as quickly as possible.
As a follow-up, an audience member wants to know what your thoughts are on nuclear power as one of those transition fuels.
Yeah, so this isn't a a popular opinion, but I don't care. Wind and solar is not going to cut it. Like nuclear is critical to our future, and so right now we're closely working with the Biden campaign on what that I don't think we'll call it a Green New Deal come 2021 because apparently this is controversial now, but we like nuclear right now we're going to have to leave nuclear online even if it's not cost effective, but more importantly we have to innovate in nuclear. Like nuclear I think is ultimately, if like we need to support billions of dollars in R&D into it. We're still like afraid of designs that were done 40-50 years ago. Like we didn't even try to innovate in it, but if we innovate in it and we do it right, we can get this transition happening much faster. And it's not a popular answer, but I think the main reason there is because only the government has the money to truly fund nuclear R&D. Like the market can't do it themselves. And so we need to start from the top and go from there.
Liam, can I ask you your thoughts on this? I know you're pretty involved in a lot of this clean energy policy.
Yeah, so my take is that, I mean, like the problems with batteries is that you need to have battery storage, because with wind and solar, like wind will only work if there's a lot of wind at the moment. Solar only works if it's sunny out and it's daytime. So if you want people running their lights at night or when there's no wind, you have to have like storage in addition to having like the electric lines. And so I agree with what he was saying about nuclear, is that at least for the time being, we don't have the storage capacity to just completely cut off fossil fuels without having something like nuclear that can run day and night. That being said, I don't think it's a smart move to take a position on nuclear as like an organization. And all the climate work I've done, you can advocate for renewable energies without even mentioning the word nuclear. And like I think that's like a smart strategic organizing principle, because there are a lot of green advocacy groups that are completely opposed to nuclear because of the risks, however outdated they might be, of like with outdated nuclear plants and the risks associated with them. But then again, like there are a lot of reasons to support nuclear. So yeah, my take on the issue is that we need to work on all the renewable energies, and it's best to advocate for policy and not say explicitly that nuclear is a good or bad thing if you want to get the broadest base of support.
All right, my next question is about the GGI policy for environment. All of the issues that we've talked about today are really important for environmentalism. Evan and Colter, how does the policy that you have recently crafted with your team sought to address those issues?
Yeah, so one of the key things that Colter and I were trying to do with this environmental policy release is it's a sort of frustrating truth, but it's something that I think all environmental activists have to accept, is that there is sort of this, there is significant resistance to sort of comprehensive, cohesive environmental action, right? And so one of the key things that Colter and I were trying to do with this policy is to connect environmental issues to additional sort of existing issues. And then under that framework, you can sort of energize and sort of get people really excited about environmental action. And so obviously we did that sort of at the local level, and it's especially sort of difficult given that Virginia is a Dillon rule state and there's sort of limited mechanisms through which counties and municipalities can actually advance environmental interests, right? But sort of within that sort of sphere of politics, I guess, Colter and I were trying to find ways to sort of engage and connect people to environmental issues that have traditionally gone sort of ignored to some extent, at least.
Yeah, I think to add on to that, Virginia is a really fascinating case study in environmental policy because there's just so much variety, both demographically and then also just in terms of like the different approaches that you can take towards policy. You know, we're a state with the Dillon rule. We're also a state with one of the largest, fossil fuel monopolies that controls most of the power that comes into the state. At the same time, there's the largest population center in the state is a bastion of progressive policy and has made real advances on a lot of the issues that are hinted at and suggested within the policy that GGI has crafted. And then you also have Virginia Beach, which is a community that's culturally conservative but is probably most at risk in terms of, rising sea levels and the inclement threat of climate change. So it's just a really fascinating place to be implementing environmental policy. I think that one of the things that we really incorporated into our approach was emphasizing local policy and emphasizing local governing bodies as the means of achieving policy solutions, but still keeping those policy solutions broad enough that they wouldn't come into conflict with the really, diverse politics of the state.
All right, and then my final question for you guys, just before we close up, is what do you think, what do you recommend people can do? Like, I know that people who are watching this, I feel inspired to do more, and I'm sure they do too, but there's a point of feeling like lost on where can I help? How do I get involved? So what is your advice for that? And like, where do you see, these are really interconnected, but where do you see the most need for like a push? Where are these openings that you see that we could be successful through? I'm starting with Liam.
Cool, thanks. So on the individual level, I'd say if you want to get involved with environmental advocacy, just look for some local groups or national groups and browse their website and see if there's a way to get involved. There's a lot that can be done other than just voting and social media. We always need people writing op-eds, letters to the editor, calling and emailing politicians, and setting up lobby meetings. There's always work to do, and it's always very impactful, or it feels empowering when you do that kind of work because you're actually like connecting with elected leaders. For GGI, I would recommend like looking into carbon fee and dividend. I know you guys want to have nonpartisan policies, and that's one of the few federal level policies that I've heard about that actually have some bipartisan support, albeit limited. Mostly Democrats, but some bipartisan, some Republican support. So yeah, that's my 2 cents. I think it's important not only to focus on the local level, as it sounds like you're doing with the resolutions in Virginia, but also to focus on some state or federal level policy that would be more impactful.
Absolutely. Evan?
Yeah, one thing I would add, sort of going along the theme of a lot of this conversation, is sort of in a colloquial sense or like a day-to-day sense. I think one thing you can do, or we can all do, is sort of connect environmental issues to other things, right? So when you're talking about, racist structures that have marginalized people of color, you can talk about how, those racist structures sort of, when it comes to environmental issues, how those sort of further disproportionalities in terms of like the burden of those environmental consequences, right? So I think there are ways to sort of bring in climate change and other environmental issues into existing conversations in ways that can sort of advance the dialogue further, I guess.
Thank you. Angel?
Yes, I completely agree with Evan and Liam on what they've said so far. I think particularly right now or the next 100 days until the election are going to be really important. I think that we as the youth, we as people who love this country and want this country to do better, need to understand that in order to have our voices heard, we actually need to go out and cast one of, I guess, our only political capital, which is our vote. I know, for, once again, anecdotal, when Bernie declared that he was dropping out of the race, a lot of youth that I was surrounded with were very discouraged, and a lot of them told me that I wasn't going to go vote, I'm not going to settle for Biden. But unfortunately, I feel like this is an issue of what is the lesser of two evils. It shouldn't be that way, but I think that right now we need to come together as people and vote out the current occupant of the White House, because he isn't doing favors for environmental policy, for racial policy, for healthcare. But that's what I believe. Other than that, I think that we should find local initiatives to get a part, to join. Sunrise has hubs all over the country. You can start your own. Same thing with YCAT. yeah, start in your local communities, and I think a little change will go a long way.
Thank you so much, Hridesh.
Yeah, I think lots of youth that I've encountered, sometimes they feel somewhat not disenfranchised, but just a little bit disempowered. That they feel like, how can one youth um, help to change the system? But it really just takes one or two voices to really make a change, especially at the local or state level. Um, so if you're listening, tuning in right now, be sure to join your local Sunrise or other local environmental group. Get plugged in. You're bound to find at least like one or two environmental groups in your local area that are advocating on a local level, because the local and state levels you can have the most impact in creating lasting change. And I just recommend continue to be active, stay informed, but also don't completely depend on the electoral process to save our generation and future generations to come. That to make lasting change, the electoral process is not the only way to do that. Oftentimes the most change that actually happens and has happened in American history has been through outside pressure groups and social movements that have forced those inside centers of power, whether that be government or outside government, to change for the better, and cause our country to go in a better direction. So yeah, just be sure to not always depend on the electoral process to save us.
Great, Nikhil.
Yeah, I think everyone is spot on. I completely agree with Angel that our elections this fall are the most important thing that anyone should be focused on. I know that not a lot of people aren't necessarily excited about this particular candidate. He was not my first choice by any means, but I will say, being on the inside to some degree, that the movement, the Gen Y and Z generations have built, around a lot of these core issues, and and if you are a Bernie supporter, has had a tremendous impact on the Biden campaign, and like you'd be shocked coming on the inside. Like, I think I would say about half the people in these conversations are people who were part of the Bernie and Elizabeth Warren's campaigns, and so this has really become, it's really kind of been all the candidates coming together, bringing all their best resources and ideas together, and the policies that they're putting forth, or the policies they will be putting forth, have definitely been shifting way more left. And so I think we need to think about the bigger picture now, and that a lot of what we're fighting for is going to be near impossible if we don't win this election. We are fighting for our democracy. We are fighting for our future, and you guys are, I think a majority of you are eligible to vote now. So go and vote, and go and vote up and down the ballot. And then in terms of environmental climate issues, this might be a little self-serving, maybe not. So we are working on COVID, climate stimulus bills in multiple jurisdictions right now. Like, we have a pretty clear framework of what they're going to look like. I think locally, we plan on launching something with the DC Council this fall. So I will keep you guys posted on that, and we're also really plugged in with all the major local environmental organizations beyond Sunrise. So I'm happy to make connections to all of those as well. So yeah, stay activists, and let's save the republic. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, Colter.
Yeah, I think that was all pretty comprehensive. I think the only thing that I would add is that when we're looking at models, outside of the electoral process and outside of voting up and down the ballot, on top of social and cultural pressure, which is crucial, working at the local level to accomplish policy that can then be modeled or used as a model for larger scale projects and policy has been proven time and time again to be successful, especially with environmental policy. I think that it's just a policy area that tends to get typecasted as unfeasible and unrealistic and not economically viable. And I think by demonstrating that that's not the case at the local level, through, all of the initiatives that have been brought up already in this call, but particularly through local conservation initiatives and sustainable regulations. I think that's really an effective way to work upwards and gradually get to the point that we need to be.
Well, thank you all so much for coming. You have been an amazing panel. I'm so glad we got to hear so many different voices, and like everyone here comes from a different background that I think has been really important to our conversation. If it hadn't been all of you, I don't think it would have been as amazing as it has been. Just in wrapping up, I want to say anyone who wants to get involved with GGI, we do have fellowship applications open right now on our website, and you can also email me if you have any questions about those, or email contact@thegreatergoodinitiative.com. And tomorrow we will be sending out an email following up. So if you want the contact information of any of these panelists, it'll be in there, as well as some email templates for you to reach out to your legislators and ask them to make a change. Thank you all so much for coming. I've been so glad to be moderating this, and I hope you stay involved with GGI.
Thanks for being a great moderator, Megan.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye, guys.